gap. So part of it is just staying open, making sure that we give as many funds away as we can. But I guess my question really is, should we be doing more than that?
I guess the thing I end up thinking a lot about is, I feel like right now, the reason that the NEA is even on the chopping block, I did a Google earlier today to look at Heritage Foundation, which is like a lot of what Trump is basing his budget plans on are based off heritage stuff. And if you look at Heritage's website, they have all these articles about why the NEA should be cut, which gives you a sense of sort of who he's listening to. And one of the biggest things is that the NEA is basically the funder of elitist artists. And I feel like there's a real issue in our country right now with people people support the arts and art objects, but people don't necessarily support artists and understand what artists are. And for me, I end up thinking a lot about like, what is our obligation to share what being a creative person means in this country today, right now? How do we start talking about creativity in a day-to-day way so that it isn't perceived as something that's simply elitist, that it exists across the board? And what does that look like? That's my response.
Artists are either the 1% or they're starving. And we need to get rid of both of those ideas.
But oftentimes, I mean, I found with a lot of our projects, like when we did Kara Walker, which was hugely well received and attended, but people would go through and they would have no idea. They were like, well, who put this on? Like, they didn't know if it was like a PR thing, or if it was, connect it to an artist. And I think that that's for us, going back, like, I think art can both have a political message and it can also be very inspirational, and both are valuable and both bring, both help people to understand art and how the arts can help them look at the world around them in a different way. And so, even if a project might have a more of a political message that's harder to convey, there can be people who gravitate towards something, experience something, and it leaves them with a message, or it leaves them feeling differently. And that's just as important as kind of the political statement that an artist might want to make. And as for the NEA part, I mean, I think that's part of it, though, as to what you were saying. Like, it's not just about supporting painters and artists in museums, but that it's about supporting performing arts and visual artists and things that happen in your community that are open to the public and shouldn't be seen as elite.
Absolutely. I think that's an amazing point of, like, the arts touch people, and sometimes people are not even aware of the way in which they're being impacted by arts and culture, and it's something that I feel like there aren't enough people talking about. I don't know how we get more people to have those conversations, or who's responsible for that.
I mean, a lot of it starts, obviously with not just cutting of federal funding, but certainly arts education is a big problem, because arts education has been cut from most public schools, and it's not considered part of the curriculum, and therefore most people grow up not having art as a part of their lives unless their parents or somebody else introduces it to them. And
I mean, I think what was interesting about the Common Practice group in the UK for their first action, which was this attempt to kind of push back against government cuts, was that they made their case so well, most of the organizations received increases in government funding. So it was, somewhat miraculous case of brilliant strategy on their part. And they made the case, which I don't think they were necessarily that interested to make, but they understood that it was a case that would appeal to the then government at the time, was that the arts/culture creates value. And they actually proved it. And you can go to their website and download the documents, but they actually proved that for every dollar spent on culture, or pound in the case in the UK, that there was a significant benefit to the wider culture and the tax base and so on. And eventually the government understood this, and instead of cutting their funds, increased their funds. But also I think that's in the UK, which is part of Europe where there is a larger civic idea about the value of culture. You know, there's no greater pleasure for me, at least, than to travel through Belgium and Holland, and every small town has an interesting art gallery and a theater that's supported by the people that live in those communities. And it's not seen as elitist at all. It's seen as a part of vernacular everyday life. And I don't think we're going to get to that scenario here, but it seems to me that if the NEA funding is cut, the actual numbers, I think, as we know, are not actually huge. I mean, they're a really tiny, tiny fraction of the whole budget for the government here. But it's symbolic, and I think if they're cut symbolically, it stands for something I think that's far more critical and worrying, is that it erodes the larger idea that culture in the broadest sense has a meaningful part and role to play in most people's lives.
But I think that the argument that was made in England is the same argument that's
That's
been
been
made here.
attempted to be made here.
Yeah, and I think it is actually what has kept the NEA alive for as long as it has. I mean, certainly after the culture wars, it was really, really at risk of failing, and it has kind of steadily increased its funding over the years. I mean, minuscule comparatively, but it certainly has been able to survive, and it's not until this recent, and in fact has been really supported by many Republicans, and that has why it has survived. But now, under this administration, it just seems like it's going to be hard for anybody to come out and be outspoken around the NEA when there's so many other issues. But
So this is actually an interesting question to me in terms of like, have we failed by placing it on economics alone? Because there has been this economic argument all along.
When I think this is why the British group was somewhat reluctant to go that way, but they understood that that was likely the best route they had to a success, yeah.
And ironically, on the Heritage website, you'll also find an article that argues the NEA should be eliminated because of Kickstarter being a prime example of individual support has always been what funds the arts in America, and shouldn't we just let individual support exist? And look, Kickstarter's bigger than the NEA. And I mean that in no, I just found it very amusing that I found that today. But what I was gonna say is, like, what's the larger argument than simply economics? And I don't feel like I have an answer to that, but I think to me it's an opportunity for us to think outside of that. And something I'm also thinking about is obviously, like, yes, I'm talking to artists endowed foundations. It's a super small, super elite circle. At the same time, I think it's so important for us to think about ways that we work outside of the arts. And so what are the organizations that we're partnering with so that there's a sense of the arts being integrated too? I don't know.
Yeah, I think on the Kickstarter point, which maybe partially answers that question, is just that we are really great at funding certain types of projects, but certainly not every kind of project is an amazing fit for a public campaign. And not every artist or every organization wants to open themselves up in an early stage of working on a project to an entire public to bring along for the ride. And I think that it's just such a troublesome argument. And often we have those conversations with foundations all the time that are like, are we in competition, or is there some sort of tension between us, when really we're just offering another alternative and another way of thinking about funding?
No, I agree. And I also think that argument doesn't take into account that the NEA, yes, it will be in some ways largely symbolic, but what the NEA is funding is hundreds and hundreds of small arts organizations nationally in parts of the country that do not have the infrastructure that New York City has. And that's going to be really, really problematic. It's also supporting things like, I had a conversation today with a woman who runs the federal indemnity program, which is basically the insurance program for all major museums. They have no idea what's going to happen. They literally don't know.
yeah.
That to me is like
And
some
that's
of the
totally
larger
under the
issues.
radar, and nobody understands that, and it's.
She doesn't. The woman who's running it is like, I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer this.
Right.
Call me on Thursday.
I just think that the kind of work that happens at artist-run centers and independent spaces and not-for-profit cultural organizations often isn't properly acknowledged at the time it's happening in the present tense. So it's only a decade later, I think, the impact or effect of that work is really able to be understood, and in some cases able to be seen. So, just as for example, one of my predecessors, Bill Arning at White Columns, he organized Katie Nolan's first show, he organized Fred Wilson's first show, he organized Glenn Ligon's first show. And that took place in the late 80s and very early 90s. And of course, now we understand exactly what that means in terms of what those artists did and how their work contributed to a larger conversation that continues to unfold today. But at the time that it happened, on the corner of Greenwich and Christopher Street, the audience for those ideas was pretty small. And the reverberations for that took an awful long time to find their place. And I think the disruptiveness of what seems to be happening now, if it disrupts this sort of fragile ecology, which includes the affordability of New York and other large cities where artists gather, it will, I think, eventually have quite dramatic and irreversible effects.
So I want to segue into audience questions, if there are any, and I hope there are a bunch. But just also to say that Artadia really focuses only on cities, and this is a group that is in New York. I mean, we're all over the place, and you're looking at artists all over the place, and we're all international in terms of programs, but these are New York institutions. So with that in mind, and speaking to an audience of artists, can you guys just speak really briefly in thinking about our original goal of offering resources, but how can artists get their work seen? Maybe thinking about what you do specifically, and just suggestions, and then segue into questions. So quick recommendations.
I feel like, Carolyn, you're going to kill me. What I am interested in, as I said to Carolyn before, I'm interested in, is there an opportunity in this extreme point in time for us to think about creating a national foundation or some mechanism like that for artists in some manner? Is that the opportunity? So I end up thinking about that in terms of literally like if all the artists in the country banded together and made a community foundation.
Yes, well, Artadia is thinking about that.
So I don't feel like I have direct answers, except for I know that all of you guys in the audience and all the artists out there are the most creative. Like, everybody's resilient. Everybody's had to think through all these types of things. And so I think it is literally around I'm always open and interested in hearing what people are thinking in terms of ideas of models for changing things. So I offer sort of that in terms of it.
So grants, essentially.
We do offer, yes,
Yeah.
we offer grants, and we are thinking about ways that we can offer something specific for now. I'm also looking at how to use all of our resources in terms of the residency in New Orleans in specific new ways in response to it, that sort of thing.
How can artists get seen?
their work seen?
Get their work
I
seen.
mean, I think that's the question that is somebody that works with 310 grantees.
Yeah,
I get that question 3 times a day.
yeah.
How can artists get their work seen in all, in the commercial world, at White Columns, or not even at White Columns, but seen by just seen by their peers, by curators, by critics.
I think
In New York.
I always think that it's the best way to get your work seen is through your peers and your colleagues and the general community. Artists, a lot of people will say that artists curate the best shows at galleries. A lot of artists take it upon themselves to see everything and to really know what's going on and to exchange studio visits. That's who I listen to when I'm looking for new artists to work with, or I always like recommendations from people that I respect and that know a bit of what I'm interested in. So I think it's your community. I mean, I also send people to White Columns and places like that have some sort of registry. Yeah, but I think that we're sort of, there will always be artists that work in sort of a vacuum in their studio and the whole myth of the romantic artist, but I think New York is a very sort of exchange of ideas place, and if you have those exchanges of ideas and put yourself out in the world, I think that hopefully it does happen. And hopefully, I mean, part of the reason we're having this discussion is hopefully it does continue. I know that I wouldn't be in the position I'm in having a gallery if it wasn't a time of growth these past, since I've started working in the art world, like 15 years. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I think one of the most important exhibitions that's happened in the city in a very long time is currently on view at the Gray Art Gallery, which looks at the history of artist-run, artist-founded, and artist-cooperative galleries in the 1950s and early 60s. And it's a somewhat murky era art historically because it sort of preempts the formation of what we know as the alternative art spaces, which tend to form later in the 60s and through the 1970s. So I think it's a really clear, the catalog's fantastic too. It's a very kind of clear picture of what activity existed in that sort of post-war period. You then read, say,